What's going on, Coyote Pack? Welcome to something new. We're calling it animal news. Now, we often find that there are a lot of interesting headlines out there that have to do with animals, and we're going to take a look at some of the top headlines that we've seen over the past few months, including hammerhead worms, which are invasive and toxic, a lady that was trampled by a buffalo in Yellowstone National Park, and this isn't the first time something like this has happened. We're also going to take a look at a 19-foot Burmese python caught in Florida, and last but not least, the giant African land snail. There's going to be some fact, there's going to probably be a lot of opinion, and at the very end, it's going to just be a whole lot of animal news. First up on today's list, hammerhead worms. I'll admit that yes, they are pretty freaky looking, especially with that hammerhead shark type head. Now that's known as a cephalic plate, and this functions as a sensory organ for the worm. You don't oftentimes think about worms as being predators. You think, well, worms tunnel through the dirt, eat a lot of dirt, poop out that dirt, and it creates nutrients for the soil. Not the case with all worms, and the hammerheads are an example of one that is predatory, feasting on other worm species, slugs, snails, and other small insects that you want to find in your garden. So right off the bat, they are problematic. Now, here's the thing. That cephalic plate secretes a slimy substance that immobilizes, breaks down, and allows them to digest their prey. This toxin that it secretes is an irritant to human skin. So the problem that gardeners are facing is that when they're digging around in the dirt, getting ready to plant their tomatoes or their green peppers or their cucumbers, they're getting these worms on their hands and they're experiencing a reaction. Now, this is not going to happen to everybody. Me, for example, I can roll around in poison ivy and I don't get it. So everybody's body is going to react differently to a toxin. But here's the real problem. People are thinking that they can just chop these worms apart and eliminate them. That is not the case whatsoever, because this is a worm species, like several worms, that once you chop it up, they will actually regenerate themselves. So you chop one in half or into 10 pieces, you may end up with 2 worms, 4 worms, or 20 worms, depending on how many cuts you make.
Will you forget the head slicing thing?
The only way to truly rid your garden of these little invasive pests is to actually collect them, probably by wearing rubber gloves so you don't get that secretion on your hands, put them in a Ziploc bag, and while I would never necessarily say that you want to harm an animal, these guys are technically invasive species. So if you add salt or vinegar, or salt and vinegar together, it will essentially melt these creatures down and fully eliminate them. Is the hype bigger than it's made out to be? Well, as long as you keep an eye out in your garden, and if you see these worms, pick them up safely with gloves, you're probably going to be just fine. But remember, don't cut them in half, because if you do, you're just going to make more worms. Now, if you think these worms are exciting, wait until you see what we're about to talk about next. A lady got trampled by a bison. Let's take a look at the clip.
It didn't want to go through the bushes again. Oh, no. Oh, shit.
So you might recognize that clip. I saw it, I don't know, maybe about a year ago, and at the time I think it had 3 million views on TikTok. And that's one of those videos that you have to watch again and again and again, because you're like, how did this happen? I can tell you how it happened. Bison are incredibly unpredictable, and every year we seem to have the same problem. Now, in all fairness, she did try to walk on the outskirts of the bison. So when you say, all right, well, I'm just gonna admire this animal from a safe distance, what truly is a safe distance? Now, this past week I read an article about a 47-year-old woman in Yellowstone. This just happened in July. Her and her family woke up and they decided to go for a walk around the lake. And of course, they came across a bison. Now, it says she was 50 yards away. 50 yards can be hard to gauge. Unless you're a golf caddy, like I used to be back in the day, it's real tough to look into the distance and say, cool, that's safe. But let's put it this way, bison are capable of covering an insane distance in a very short period of time. So this buffalo's rolling around in the dust, doing what buffalo do, and all of a sudden he noticed the humans and he charged this woman, because that's just what happens. Bison are unpredictable. So no matter where you are, if you stop and you look at a bison, be aware that at any point that bison may just decide to run you over. What you want to do in that situation is literally curl up in a ball and hope that you can withstand the hit, because you're not going to get up and run away from it. Now, the good news for Amber is that she is okay, but she was life-flighted out of the situation. She had broken ribs, she had contusions, she had her lungs collapsed. Think about that. You're talking about an animal that weighs over 2,000 pounds with a head like a battering ram, horns that are capable of goring you, but really the most dangerous thing is the weight and the hooves. I actually followed this site on Instagram called Tourons, which is a combination of tourists and morons. And I think it's fantastic, because the big thing that we need to remember is people who love wildlife. A buffalo, a bear, a moose, these animals are capable of turning on a dime and deciding that they're going from eating food or just enjoying their leisurely day to, all right, a human's gotten too close and I'm going to eliminate the threat. So a word to the wise, stay in your car. stay in your car, get a picture from the window. Do not try to approach anything in the wild. There's a good chance that if that animal gets spooked, you're going to become the victim of a trampling or goring or mauling. That's going to be a really bad day for you. Now, when it comes to things you can run into in the wild, one thing you don't expect is a giant snake. Talk about the hunt of a lifetime. This 22-year-old snake hunter finds a 19-foot Burmese python, which, might I say, is a new Florida state record. I've seen some big snakes. I've even swam with anacondas. That's one of the biggest, but I've never come across a Burmese python of that size. Now, this snake was found in the Big Cypress National Preserve, and you may be wondering, well, what happens when you catch a 19-foot python? Where does that snake go? Well, this one was turned over to the Conservancy of Southwest Florida to be officially measured and documented, so we know those numbers are legit. But here's the real problem that we need to recognize with Burmese pythons. It's an invasive species that has established a stronghold, which means they have been there for years, and for anybody that's ever visited the Florida Everglades, you know it's incredibly dense. These snakes are super well camouflaged, so being able to eradicate all of them from the environment is very unlikely. And believe it or not, snakes are not the only thing invading the Sunshine State. Last up on today's animal news, the giant African land snail. Now, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services said the giant African land snail is one of the most damaging snails in the world, and they can consume up to 500 different types of plants. That's a lot of plants. I mean, this snail will eat pretty much anything. I even read that some of these snails will attach to the side of houses and eat the stucco. So when did these snails first show up in Florida? Well, the first reported sighting was back in 1966, and it took 10 years and $3 million to eradicate this first snail infestation. So they thought they were all gone until 2021, and then they realized they were back. And at that point, it took $23 million to wipe them out again. So where are these invasive snails coming from? Well, there's a couple of possibilities. One, people tend to keep them as pets. They're cool, they're impressive, they're big, but unfortunately sometimes people have pets, and then when they don't want the pets anymore, especially in Florida, they let them out into the environment, and that's where the problem begins. Another possibility is that they're being brought in illegally as part of the food trade. In some countries, like West Africa, they are considered a delicacy. Now, if you come across one of these snails in your backyard, definitely don't try to eat it, and here's why. These snails can be carriers of a parasite called the rat lungworm, which can carry a fatal type of meningitis in humans. So what happens if you come across one of these snails in your yard? Well, the first thing is you don't want to touch it. Take a picture, get the GPS coordinates, and then contact your local Fish and Wildlife Services. They will come out and they will try to eradicate the problem with something known as a molluscicide that only targets these giant snails. They're a problem, and the last thing we need is more giant snails taking over the Florida ecosystem. And there you have it. Toxic worms, unpredictable bison, giant snakes, and invasive snails. I'm Coyote Peterson. Stay wild, and we'll see you on the next broadcast of Animal News.